The other day, I came across a tweet that I thought perfectly encapsulated some of the dynamics of the dogmatic new zealous convert to a religious faith. It does so within the context of Roman Catholicism, but I think some of the dynamics present there are present across dramatic, zealous religious conversions. So let's take a look at the tweet and then reflect on it a little bit. So the individual writes, every lifelong Catholic I've ever met is like, I think we're supposed to give this food to poor people. And every adult convert is like, the Archon of Constantinople's epistle on the Pentecostine rites of the Eucharist clearly states women shouldn't have driver's licenses. I think that's pretty funny. Obviously, there's hyperbole there, exaggeration for effect, but I think there's some important points there. And I want to parse out three different points from that tweet. The first point, I think, is that there's a tacit contrast between what we can call the zeal of the new convert versus the quiet devotion of the long-term disciple. So the new convert, they're like a person that's just quote unquote fallen in love. They think that the fact that they're thinking about the other individual all the time and they're giving them gifts and they need to be with them all the time, that intoxicating infatuation, that is somehow a deep sense of devotion to the other individual. And they might even look askance at the lifetime quiet disciple who just lives in what Eugene Peterson famously called a long obedience in the same direction. They might look at that person askance because they don't have that zealous commitment, this infatuation with the other, the beloved. But what that individual, the lifelong disciple, often does have is that long obedience in the same direction. It's a quiet devotion, like the intimacy of a married couple who finishes each other's sentences after they've been together for 50 years. Each one knows what the other one is thinking, and they have this deep, profound connection. They don't need to think about one another all the time. They don't need to be together all the time, but there is a quiet devotion in contrast to that more unstable, zealous infatuation or focus. So that's the first contrast I think is being made there. The second is that the zealous new convert often has a misevaluation of priorities. So they focus on things that are relative minutia. They think that something like women shouldn't have driver's licenses, and that's going to be a defining hallmark of my concept of Christian faithfulness. That becomes for them the thing that they focus on because they're not deeply rooted in the faith. So they don't appreciate that the things that are the most important, as Jesus famously said, love God and love your neighbor. And and your neighbor, of course, for Jesus was anybody in your midst and anybody in need. The least of these is your neighbor. And to appreciate that your neighbor is an image of God. They are made in the image of God and so are an icon of God. And so if you're not loving your neighbor, then by definition, you are not loving God. And so, a simple lived out action of mercy, compassion, love, and faithfulness, like giving food to poor people, is far more important than your observation of the Archon of Constantinople's epistle on the Pentecostine rites of the Eucharist. Okay, the third thing, so not only is this new zealous convert apt to miss the forest for the trees, they're apt to miss the most important things, but also in their very mode of theological analysis and reflection and an attempt to live out an ethical stance of discipleship in accord with their theological understanding, that often evinces a naivete about the degree to which there is historical development and contextualization in the formation of beliefs, and to recognize how you have to accommodate for limited historical contextualized understandings. So you look back at the Archon of Constantinople's epistle on the Pentecostal rites of the Eucharist, and you may indeed conclude, oh, according to that, women shouldn't have driver's licenses. But then you have a deeper theological analysis that says, I need to understand this epistle in its historical, socio-historical context, understand where it came from, how it developed, how it was responding to issues of its day with the limited horizons and understanding of the writer of the epistle, and reflect on that theologically as I try to understand what to do in my day. See, for the new zealous convert, it's very tempting just to go back to contextualized, limited historical sources and treat them as absolutes, as if they had a God's eye point of view or a view from nowhere, that they saw things as they should be. And because then they can provide the definitive word for what we should do in our day. And it's much more threatening and destabilizing to consider that maybe these are fallible, limited perspectives and that we in fact need to recognize them as such as we seek to consider what does it mean to love our neighbor in our day. And yet it is the latter that is the far deeper, more mature understanding. And this applies to the Bible as well. That when the fundamentalist, like the new zealous convert, wants to treat everything that is contained in the Bible as God's word for all time, you're treating biblical passages that often have their own contextualized um, and limited horizons of understanding. You're treating them like this fellow's treating the Archon of Constantinople's epistle, rather than to recognize that what you do is you need to take in your historical, ethical, theological, philosophical reasoning, all of the Wissenschaft that informs how you think theologically as you engage with the biblical text. Because what you end up otherwise doing is naively privileging some particular interpretation as the absolute word, rather than to recognize that texts are always interpreted, and the interpretation that you glom onto or you are attracted to is going to be impacted in all sorts of ways you may not appreciate by your own limited socio-historical understanding and existential angst, et cetera, because you want a quick, definitive, easy word to understand everything. And it's just much messier than that. I mean, the simplest example I can give is the young earth creationist who thinks, well, uh, Bible says God created in 6 days and a day is a day. So obviously he created 6 24-hour days. And we can look at that and say, well, of course, that's not really true. But you know what? Once you recognize that the natural literal reading for the contemporary English reader is not necessarily the right reading, that can be pretty destabilizing and it can turn things on their head because now you have to think, how do I interpret Genesis? That's like, how do I interpret the Archon of Constantinople's epistle on the Pentecostal rites of the Eucharist? And it's a lot more complicated than that zealous new convert may appreciate. I guess the last thing I'll say about this tweet is just how this is capturing, I think, a particular ethos that I'm seeing right now. And I'm seeing it among many who want to talk from a sort of Christian nationalist lens about the various ways and detail that they think society should be formed based upon their understanding of the Bible and of theology. And yet they're not doing something as basic as loving their neighbor. They are, for example, silent on or even promoting xenophobic othering rhetoric of migrants, of people on the margins, of the least of these. They are silent or even satisfied when a resident of their country is taken without any legal process and sent off to a prison in El Salvador. They're fine with that. And yet they want to debate some of the theological precision of the Archon of Constantinople's epistle on the Pentecostal rites of the Eucharist. And that is a classic case of missing the forest for the trees. You're examining the bark of one of the trees and you don't see the entire forest. The forest, which says, above all, if you're not giving food to poor people, if you're not loving your neighbor as yourself, you have not got the main message.